Welcome to another episode of On the Issues with Alon Ben-Meir. Today's guest is Carlein Boers, a political scientist focusing on the national political process in Israel, as well as proposals toward a two-state solution for Palestine and Israel. She also served 17 years as a civilian officer in the field of military international cooperation and special air operations. In this episode, Alon and Carlein discuss the seemingly thorniest issue discussed in negotiations over a two-state solution for Israel and Palestine, the status of Jerusalem. They discuss previous negotiations involving Jerusalem, as well as propose novel ideas for its status and relation to future Israeli and Palestinian states.
Thank you, Carlein, for taking the time. I think our discussion for today about the future of Israeli-Palestinian peace, reaching an agreement about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, based on everything we have seen over the last 30 plus years even. There's and the potential of reaching an agreement on many issues is there. It's been discussed at Camp David, it's been discussed in 2008 with Olmert, but there was no final decision made, a final agreement made on East Jerusalem. You wrote a very interesting idea. You advanced a very interesting idea about how can this issue be resolved, specifically in connection with East Jerusalem. That is, Israel still can claim West Jerusalem as its capital. That will not change under your proposal. So for our listeners, I think if you could summarize your idea of what kind of a solution can you advance in order to resolve this very, very complex issues of Jerusalem.
Well, thank you, Alon, for having me. It's always a pleasure talking to you and discussing the future of this region and sharing both a sense of hope for the region. As you said, Jerusalem has always been that one topic that has been very emotional to all parties concerning. It's a very sensitive topic, and therefore it was always left to final status negotiations when it came to establishing a Palestinian state and a two-state solution. One of the bottlenecks in those negotiations was also always the old city of Jerusalem, meaning the holy site. So it's the Haram al-Sharif, which holds the Dome of the Rock and Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is on top of the Western Wall and what the Jews call the Temple Mount, where the Holy of the Holiest to Judaism is situated. And a stone throw from there is the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, where Christ died at the cross and was re-risen. So to three monotheistic religions is a very important area. At the beginning of the UN partition plan, one of the ideas was to have a separate entity consisting of those holy sites, which had to be supervised by the UN. That idea quickly went out of the so-called window, and over the years, Jerusalem was pushed forward. It's too sensitive. Let's reach an agreement on other things first. But then, in the end, a solution was never reached, just because it was so sensitive. We can get into that later, but one of the things I would like to propose is to get the holy sites out of the politics, out of the discussion, which still makes every negotiation for a two-state resolution at the moment. And perhaps we could have a look on whether or not we could create an independent state just in that square kilometer. And as a model, you could use Vatican City, which is part of a mini-state, the Holy See, which consists of the Vatican City and holy sites throughout Italy. And by this, at this moment, looking at, for example, Pope Francis' funeral, religious leaders at the moment actually get along. They get more along than the political leaders at the moment. They speak extensively about a shared humanity. the need for interreligious dialogue, let them rule the holy sites. Take it out of politics. If that means that by removing this sensitive topic, leaving it to religious leaders, we can perhaps finally push for a final settlement and 2 independent states and the end of a conflict.
What you're suggesting certainly makes sense in the sense that this had always been a sticking problem. And so far, no government in Israel and throughout the various negotiations that took place between Israel and the Palestinian. In particular, you mentioning Camp David Accord, Camp David 2000 and 2008 under the prime ministership of Ehud Olmert. The issue of Jerusalem was seriously discussed, but in the end, there was no agreement, albeit the main disputing issue between Olmert and the Palestinian Authority at the time was not as much as East Jerusalem, because there was an agreement about East Jerusalem in principle, that it would be governed, administered by the Palestinians, which was the percentage of the land swap. They did not agree on the percentage of the land swap at the time. That was the most sticking point. So your idea is not entirely about what you say in your paper out of the box. Because in fact, I fully agree with you also. In various discussions between the religious leaders of the 3 monolithic religion, Christian, Jews, and Muslim, they do see more eye to eye than the politicians, because they understand one thing, that is, you can argue about territory, you can discuss borders, you can discuss security, you can reach an agreement about many of these issues on some. When it comes to religion, a set of belief, that is an extremely difficult to alter, to modify, to change. That is a conviction, it's a religious conviction. And that is where you're coming with an idea that could resonate in the sense that all 3, specifically the Muslim and the Jews, can see eye to eye, provided, however, that their belief and conviction about the future of Jerusalem is not altered. That is, as long as they can still have free access, they can still call it any way they want to call it. And what you are saying, as an independent entity along the idea, the model of the Vatican, could work. The question here, under what circumstances? And this is the problem I have been facing all along. And I know you probably read my paper on the subject when I spoke about the future of Jerusalem.
Yes, I did.
It has some elements of what you are also saying. That is, Jerusalem cannot be divided again. It's impossible. Everything is connected, everything, the roads, the electrical grid, name it. There is no way you can build a wall between East and West. Neither the Palestinian, in fact, nor the Israelis want to see a wall like that. So the unity of East and West, it has to be a given. There's got to be a given. And do you agree with that proposition that it must be a given? That
it's so intertwined in Jerusalem at the moment. Me coming from Europe, knowing what a divided city as Berlin was, and how emotional ridden that is. You don't want to divide what is in a sense such a small area. My concern is that square kilometer which houses these specific holy sites.
right.
And as you said correctly, if it's part of what I believe is a part of a political entity, which is some establishment between a Palestinian and Israeli state, you still have the issue of guaranteeing free access. And at the moment, it's not guaranteed. So because now and then Haram al-Sharif is closed off for access for security reasons, etc., etc. This closing off of the area initiated on numerous times violence in that region. Hamas will claim it is the incentive for what they call the Al-Aqsa flood operation, October 7. So you want to take this out, you want to guarantee free access, and you want to counter the extremist variants of the religion. So
Right.
it's the extremists who connect messianic ideas to Jerusalem.
Right.
There will be the return of the Messiah until Temple Mount is completely free. There won't be Al-Mahdi, the Muslim Messiah, until the entire Al-Aqsa is free. So you want to counterpart this, and by this I want to give voice to the religious establishment that are now in place, because they have 2,000 years of experience talking to each other, keeping the peace.
So if we are agreeing that the city ought to remain united, that there should be, we cannot put a wall around East Jerusalem. Their idea of establishing it as an independent state, or call it an independent entity for that matter, that both Muslim, Christians, Jews have free access to it. However, it's administered by a certain body. You mentioned in your paper there's lack of trust, for example, in the United Nations, and I agree with you. The United Nations probably is not the ideal entity, authority to run such an independent, and it has to be, in my view, perhaps a composition of religious leaders from all three monolithic religions to be in charge of the administration of the city, rather than a political body. That is, once you introduce a political dimension into this religious core issue, I don't think the two are compatible. They just won't work.
No, what I fear that this issue will keep hijacking the conflict and will prevent any.
So you agree with that?
I fully agree with that.
Okay, so let's now look at the other problems that surround this issue. We agree that it's united. We agree that there has to be free access. Now you have other religious institutions outside Jerusalem. For example, the city of Hebron, where there is a very holy site, for example, where the Jews claim their Rivka is buried there. And there is plenty of evidence to suggest there is definitely powerful religious connection to the city of Hebron. And there are other places where the Israelis feel this is their land, it was always their land, and the architecture, all these discoveries that we make in the last several years point out to the fact that they are there, and this is Jews who were there, and many of the archaeologists have found great deal of evidence to that effect. But that possibly could be set aside. What are some of the problems that arise along what you are suggesting, albeit there is a foundation to what you're saying? For example, the settlements that surround Jerusalem, which are built in the West Bank. How do we deal with these settlements? Should they be regained? Because now it is called still Jerusalem, part of Jerusalem. That should have to be excluded, obviously, from your ideas. So from your perspective, what do you do with this settlement that surrounds Jerusalem? They were built on the assumption to protect Jerusalem from outside intruders or outside enemy.
It is my understanding that numerous negotiations already agreed, or to 95% agreed on how to deal with these settlements and the Arab villages surrounding Jerusalem, which now considered Greater Jerusalem. This will have to be part of the final negotiations between Israel and the Palestinians on how to decide which part is under which authority. And at the same time, you're right, you have that challenge of wanting to keep a united Jerusalem. The question is, where are the borders of that Jerusalem?
Okay, so the focus will have to be then on discussing borders. That is, what constitutes is Jerusalem. I'm sorry, go ahead.
At the same time, this might be very Dutch way of thinking. We here have very central government and decentralized government. So you could decide on Jerusalem, East, Western Jerusalem as capitals of either state. But in order to keep the city together as a unity, you could decide to have a decentral unity as having one municipality in which inhabitants can vote for city elections, etc. So
Yeah.
perhaps that could be an out-of-the-box solution.
In my I offered the solution of I think you read it. What I suggested at the time is that yes, East Jerusalem can be the capital of the Palestinians as they are demanding, and Israel certainly will retain West Jerusalem as its capital. So that will not change under any circumstances, and they create a body from both Israeli Jews and Arabs and Palestinians, a certain authority that may include the Christian as well, for that matter, that will address all the religious components in East Jerusalem. That is, this body is composed of all the three monolithic representative of religion, would be sort of taking charge of the holy sites and all of that related to, albeit the Palestinian can still call East Jerusalem as their capital, and Israel can still call West Jerusalem as its capital. That is, both can say Al-Quds my capital, and Israel can say Yerushalayim is my capital, but they have this third body. Responsibility is to administer the holy sites, for that matter, maintaining the unity. But the problem here, I admit there is a problem in terms of the extent to which Israel would allow the development in East Jerusalem, for example. To what extent Israel prepared to cede total and complete authority to the Palestinian in running the city of East Jerusalem, per se. So there is that issue. Even with my ideas, still we have this particular issue.
I hear.
Do you feel, and my question to you is, do you feel that your proposal could overcome that?
Hopefully, in part, when it comes to religious sites, because outside of that holy city, you do have holy sites that have an emotional connection to either all three religions or just the two. You mentioned Hebron, there's also Bethlehem, perhaps even Nazareth. And that's a separate issue from the settlements. So let's focus first on those religious sites. The way the Holy See is now composed is that territory of the Vatican City, as well as Christian religious sites in Italy that have a strong connection to the Catholic faith. So you go out of Rome, for example, and you come to a specific church, for example, the Church of St. Paul outside the walls, that is Vatican territory. So you could find perhaps a way where you can say, as soon as you enter the cave of the patriarch, in which I think is also Hebron, I'm not entirely sure, you say this is also territory of that entity that controls the holy city in Jerusalem. What we need for that is the immediate cessation of building more settlements, because that seems to have been the policy over the last year. Just surround sites by settlements, make it very difficult to find any solution in a final settlement negotiation because you have sites surrounded by religious initiated settlements. So
right, I think this is very important.
That's number one, and it needs to stop for the sake of everyone, because it's one of the other big bottlenecks to any solutions in the future. Then what to do with the current settlements? Various ideas have arisen. I don't think what they did in 2004, if I remember correctly, when they left the settlements in Gaza Strip, where they just picked up everyone, moved them out, and left the settlements as some sort of compensation payment for a future Palestinian state, being first in Gaza Strip. I think history has shown that was not the way to do it, so you need to find another solution. Another solution that people have looked into is that land for peace, land swap. That could be an option. I'm not entirely up to date on the pros and cons on that issue. But the most stressing point is the succession of those settlements built by very messianic driven settlers. Because they will feel when the only way to save the Jewish people or bring about the arrival of the Messiah if there is complete Jewish control of every inch of ancient Israel. And you have on the other side the extremists on the Muslim side say Hamas, look at their charter, they say the only way future of Palestine if it's on the complete Islamic rule. And this is what I feel religious extremism hijacking the conflict and preventing any solution. Not sure you're more knowledgeable about the current status of discussions on settlements. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on this.
Based on previous discussion, negotiation, I was involved in back channel struck too, involved in various negotiations in the back, going back 20, 25 years for that matter. The discussion about the settlement during, when Netanyahu was negotiating 2013-14, that was just a play. He never intended to agree on anything in the end, just to pacify Barack Obama at the time. Well, that's about it. But in 2008 and under Olmert, there was an agreement. There was an agreement. The agreement is called, since Israel categorically will not vacate all the settlement, period. But they were open to remove, since these settlements are dotted all over the West Bank, but many of them are small, with 500 or 1,000 settlers, no more than that. The vast majority are small settlements, not like Ariel or, and some other big ones. These small ones, where they have roughly they house about 80,000 to 100,000 settlers out of the total of nearly 700,000, they'll be moved into the larger settlement. There's an agreement on that in order to allow for land contiguity for the Palestinians by removing these small settlements into the bigger ones, which was part of the land swap that they agreed upon in principle. And one thing is, I want you to know that not all the settlements are built by Messianic Jews who, not all, as a matter of fact, these are a minority, not a majority. I mean, I know firsthand the vast majority, if given the opportunity for better housing, better living, they will uproot, they will relocate. They'll have no problem with that. And the reason they are there, these places, because they can build big houses, they have wonderful views, clean air, and all of that. If you give them pretty much the same conditions, they will move. That was the premise of the negotiation with the Olmert and at the time with the Palestinian Authority. So of course we are deviating from the question of Jerusalem to the settlement, but it is very much integral part, which means going back to the settlement that surrounds Jerusalem. That was to remain under Israeli control, and does not negate your idea necessarily. That is because you are talking about holy city in East Jerusalem. Doesn't include greater, what Israel called Greater Jerusalem. That does not include that. So the existing of this settlement does not necessarily negate or is inconsistent with their idea. So that's why I mentioned that, because it is an important factor in any future negotiation between the two sides as to the ultimate the status of East Jerusalem. But what other requisites, however, are required? what do you think other requisites ought to be in place?
Cool.
That is in order to materialize your idea. Because the ideas are great, but you need now to create the mechanism that make it possible. And that would include certainly political will. It would have to include involvement of other powers. It could be involved the religious institution. So what do we need to put in place in order to facilitate the idea that you are advancing? I mean, we want to discuss some of these options because you need the tools, you need the means by which to realize an idea of yours.
One of the more practical things is the current peace agreement between Israel and Jordan, which specifies, as you know, that in any future negotiations there will be a specific role for Jordan, the Hashemite king, being the direct descendant of the Prophet Muhammad. And as you mentioned, who's currently responsible for the administrative authority over the Haram. And this is both a political and a religious entity. So we'll have to.
But there's an agreement on that, though. Israel has peace with Jordan.
It's legally binding. Jordan has to have a role. So in order to create something like a Vatican state, like independent entity, it needs the approval from the Israelis, the Palestinians, and the Jordanians.
I agree.
Next, religion has many flaws, but as we said, they seem to be the ones who get along at the moment. So, but asking them to take this ruling role for part in the world that's so important for 4.5 billion people, it's their willingness to take that role and do it
But the
together.
prerequisite, they'll have to get together first. They'll have to get together first to agree. That is the three representative of the three religions. They have to be these respected religious leaders that no one can doubt their sincerity, their commitment, their vision. They need to agree in advance. This is what we have to promote. And I agree with you. That is going to be a second critical component.
Yeah, and I think since there are already 3 entities with a specific focus on Jerusalem, they already are in conversation with each other, not on how to rule, but on how to get along, keep the peace, etc. So they'll find their way. They have very knowledgeable negotiators, like Cardinal Pizzaballa, who's the patriarch of the Catholic part in Jerusalem, as well as the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem. So I'm sure they will figure it out. They will find some common basis, find it in religion, find it in the religious text. I'm sure they'll figure it out, but they need the confidence as well of the world to say, okay, we're going to give you the confidence and the authority to rule that part. Go ahead and do it.
So the second, I just want to establish points. That is the prerequisite. We mentioned that you need the political will, obviously, but the very important is what you're saying. That is, there's got to be a religious group that is representative of all three religion to agree that this is an agenda they're going to have to pursue. So Jordan is a factor, extremely important factor, because it's already in play. The second one is the religious leaders need to agree. Let's continue along these lines. What other prerequisite, what other component need to be added to make this, to materialize what you are saying?
Yeah, to my view, a third important thing is how to control the border of that entity, because it will border on both Israel and a Palestine state in future, hopefully. But how to deal with security for those areas. Very practical. What happens if riots like they have happened before in that old city, when they start again, now the Israeli police will intervene, or whether or not it's on top of the Al-Haram, the Jordanian police will intervene together with the Palestinian forces. What will happen if that's just a religious entity? And we need to think about that as well. We need to.
Well, it's very important component. That is the security dimension. There's no question about it. That is, it is an entity. For example, how is the security is maintained in the Vatican today? What are the security apparatus? And in fact, the Italian government does not intervene. I mean, providing an overall security around the Vatican, but they not intervene in the internal security matter. That is the case?
Yeah.
So yeah, I agree with you. I agree with you. There is a need to establish a security arrangement to this entity as a prerequisite to agreeing to that. That's the third component we agree on, definitely.
And it's easier for the Vatican, who's right in the middle of Italy, and there are not hostilities between.
Of course.
So
I mean, that's why it's important what you are saying in terms of security, because that has always been the problem and will continue to be a problem. So you need to establish security mechanism acceptable to both sides, but not only acceptable, but actually practical, doable. And the question is, what entity should be created? Again, I'm going to go the point to a resolution. What entity should be created to monitor security arrangement? Where that entity come from? Where it's going to come from?
If we're going to say it's going to be on the model of the Vatican, which means an independent state, then the ruling authority of that independent state will be in charge of security at that site within the borders, coordinating with the bordering countries.
But where do they get the personnel? How do they choose who are these people and to what extent, what kind of authority this security apparatus? I'm really raising this question. I mean, there's got to be there's a solution. Obviously, there have to be a solution. I'm really digging into these little things in order to think more deeply about it. And that is, yes.
But it's in the end, it should be up to whatever they decide as that knowledgeable authority in that city state.
But you would maybe agree that
a Swiss guard.
Would
that would mean that another country should voluntarily send their troops for a period of time as the security of that entity. So I'm not entirely sure. A Holy City Police Force, perhaps?
Well, we're talking about options. For example, my thinking goes like this. Palestinian Authority, Israel, as well as provide the combined military security forces. I want to call it military forces, security forces, well trained to take care of that. That's one possibility. Another possibility is outside powers, maybe in conjunction with Israeli Palestinian or without necessarily outside power that both people trust. They will be neutral to take care of security to make sure. That's another possibility. And a possibility perhaps a UN-sponsored peacekeeping forces, so to speak, and also can go there and make sure the security arrangement is being done. And of course, this force has to be a quite unique force in the sense that they have to have no commitment or affinity, specific affinity to either the religious side or the Muslim side. They are pretty much independent. And that's going to be tricky, to form this kind, but I think it's possible. Definitely there are possibilities of forming such a force, such a security force. Again, various combination of what I mentioned and some. Any other ideas around from your perspective in terms of?
Obviously, top of mind is United Nations and UN forces based on voluntary contribution from member states. were it not this part of the world where trust in the United Nations is completely gone. So in order to have something like blue helmets, perhaps we need to look at an entirely new idea and entity of countries willing to contribute security forces with the blessing of the two independent states, because they need to coordinate and
acceptable to both sides.
acceptable to those religious leaders in charge.
Right. So that's another issue. Then what other components are necessary? And we just want to make sort of a list that is critically important. That is, ideas are great. Your ideas are great. We need to establish mechanism of implementation. That's what I'm saying. What do you think? There's a fourth component, in my view. What would that fourth component should be?
Should be a mutual agreement between those religious leaders in charge on how to deal with excavations in that part of the world and on religious side. And I'm mentioning it because the archaeological remains on the Temple Mount Haram al-Sharif are also a sensitive topic and essential to keeping the peace. In the past, the opening of the tunnel underneath the Haram was the beginning of violence, etc. And I found in previous negotiations that they did discuss this, where they say there can only be excavations. Excavations important to all three religions if there's a mutual agreement on those excavations.
I mean, this is definitely a necessary component. Yeah. That's when we can put this as number 4. That is an agreement on archaeological digging discoveries and under what supervision.
Existence of God by archaeological evidence.
And again, there's a framework for that ought to be established, but between the 2 or 3 sides for that matter. And I think this is an important fourth component. The other prerequisite, obviously, I think what we mentioned earlier, and that is you have to have an agreement first on all other pending matters, on the refugees, on the settlements, on the general overall security between the 2 sides.
To water.
And all of that, water distribution, all of it. So that's a fifth component. That is as a prerequisite to your idea. What other, it's number 5, what other components do you think we're going to need? I'm not testing you, I'm thinking with you.
I'm thinking in the context of this creation of this entity, or to get towards a final settlement which will be the end of conflict. So
yeah, we agree, that's point 5. There's got to be an agreement about all other issues, settlements, refugees, and all of that. That obviously has to be agreed upon as a prerequisite to implementation of the idea. But let's look at number 6. There are 6 or 7 components. What would be number 6? I'm thinking with you, really. In my mind, for example, you need a political will on both sides. That is, you need a government in Israel and a Palestinian Authority that is open to discuss something of the sort. Now, what is it going to take to create that kind of mindset within the Israelis and the Palestinians in order to advance the rise of such leaders who would be open to the possibilities? Because if you don't have leaders who are willing to discuss it, it won't happen.
Well, in that case, it's back to basically guaranteeing free elections on both sides right now.
Yes, a free election will have to take place, but this has to be on the agenda.
Wanting, as long as current leaders are in place, there won't be any discussion of the sort, I believe. There's not a chance for new leaders to arise, the younger generation to arise. So you need elections. And I'm sure there will be parties who will want a final resolution because they want to say, enough of the violence. We need a clean divorce from each other in order to survive as people.
But again, election necessary, but election there's got to be candidates, leaders, who will actually spell out this. That is, they cannot have it a hidden agenda. They have to say, that is, if there is a moment, you see, if point number 4, we said an agreement on other issues as a prerequisite. So that in and of itself could create the momentum. That is, since we agreed on everything else, should we now let this Jerusalem be the problem, the only problem is going to break, to make it impossible to reach peace agreement. So that's why I'm bringing this issue. That is, you need to create the moment. That is, an agreement creates a momentum to continue the process in order to reach an agreement, which means that you need the political will. The political will comes from leaders on both sides, who actually is a new election, people running on the premise, now we have an agreement. And the leaders are going to say, let's implement this, your idea. Let's just say, let's now move toward that, because that is a solution that neither of us can still have their cake and eat it. That is, we are not really giving up in a way anything other than for the Israelis to say administration of East Jerusalem, because there's no such a thing. The administration of East Jerusalem is going to be independent. Independent. To both people can relate to. That question, the final question that I raise in my mind, and that is the already preordained notion, sentiment by the Israelis and by the Palestinians. The Palestinian or the Arab world still call Al-Quds. Al-Quds ought to be the capital of the Palestinian state, and the Israelis are saying Jerusalem, Yerushalayim, all of Yerushalayim ought to be. That is the seventh component, in my view. You need to change my public mindset, and that is again, it's who can do that? That is changing public mindset. You're going to have a mechanism for that as well. And who would be the greatest, the best representative of that can speak with authority to impact public opinion on both sides, that this is a solution that everybody can live with. So we need a campaign by whom, that in order to influence public opinion, because public opinion today, I want to share with you some statistic, which is very interesting, very, very interesting. And I was somewhat a little surprised by it. This is albeit from 2015 and 16, so 10 years ago. But based on what I know, really not very much has changed, except since the last 2.5 years, because of this extremist government that is running the country today. But if short of that, if there's a new government more open, these numbers probably would be still reflected. Say 22% support maintaining the status quo. Only 22%. 29% favored increasing physical separation in East Jerusalem, increasing the physical separation. And then 26% supported transferring Arab neighborhood to the Palestinian Authority. Arab neighborhood is being defined pretty much most of East Jerusalem to the Palestinian Authority. And when it's 23% back establishing a separate local authority for Arab neighborhood under Israeli sovereignty. But if the question were to be asked, what do you think of establishing an independent entity along the line of what you're suggesting? We don't have an answer for that. We don't have an answer for that yet. Again, these numbers are not set in stone. Definitely could be changed one way or the other, but possibly not a major percentages are going to change. This give me more hope that there is a level of flexibility now among the Israelis. Sure, once this government is out of the picture, obviously that's a prerequisite. And if the Palestinian also will have to have their own public campaign to say, look, we cannot have it all, so we might settle for this. So the seventh component, in my view, is how do you how do you change public opinion to support your idea, short of anything else that's practical to be done. It's because so far they have not succeeded. They have reached coming close to an agreement, but has never been really completely concluded.
No,
What's your take on that?
that's why I was circling back to election, because that will give leaders need a big mandate. And if they have a mandate, they are more theoretically successful in convincing their people this is the right way forward. You had, for example, someone like Yitzhak Rabin, who went from there will never be a Palestinian state, it's not for the sake of security, convincing his people, listen, I am a soldier, I fought my entire life for the existence of the state of Israel. This is the best way forward. And at the same time, you need similar leaders in that region. Used to have King Hussein, who said the same thing. I believe for the sake of everyone, this is the best way forward. And if we can find leaders like this who can amass the mandate during elections to get that political mandate to go forward and tell everyone, this is the best solution for everyone. This will give the most viable solution ahead.
But again, provided those who are running in these elections, the various heads of various parties, like today we have in an election, sometimes we have 17, 18, 19 different parties running in Israel. Not as many among the Palestinians, but you have many in Israel. So the leaders, some of these leaders will have to run on the agenda openly. They'll have to say, I support your idea. And they have to be able to elect it. That is still the public will have to absorb that, internalize that, accepted that to be giving them the vote necessary for them to proceed with that particular open agenda, not a hidden agenda. It cannot be open. And they, of course, they need the support of many, many components. They need support from religious institutions, the support from foreign powers, the support from Arab states, specifically Saudi Arabia and Jordan. They both have interesting interest in finding a solution to the future of East Jerusalem. These elements will have all come to play in order to facilitate that what you are saying here. So
I do think that those leaders are there. They just need the chance to be able to even run for office. I'm absolutely sure that the majority of people want a solution, and there are younger leaders just waiting for that opportunity to arise.
do you think in Israel, for example, a leader that's coming from a religious background, not fanatic, not radical religious, but has a religious background, known to be a believer, deep believer, who would say, advance this idea that is coming from a religious figure, respected religious figure. And there are some in Islam who would actually take this mantra and say, look, there's got to be an end to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. This is a major stumbling block. And he or she has that credential. Mostly it's going to have to be he, because the Jews don't think that a female religious leader will cut the mustard, so to speak. And that's how it is, regardless whether we like it or not. So that he will have that stature to be able. I mean, again, I'm just throwing notions in terms of bringing this to reality. You need to create all these mechanisms to put it together, and then becomes credible for discussion. That is, to give it the credibility for discussion. Because your idea is great, and I think what we're trying to do today together is establish the mechanism. And one thing else I want to throw at you and tell me when I advance, and I intend to pick this up, because right now, given the turmoil that's going on, still ongoing war, to advance this idea, coming into it, is a little out of the picture in a way. and that is the establishment of Israeli, Palestinian, Jordanian Confederation. And that is all that what we have discussed here can fall perfectly into that category, into that arrangement. Because for the Israelis, from a security perspective, if Jordan is a part and parcel of peace between the three of them, and then it's a possible. I wrote a major paper on this. I'm happy to send it to you if you want to look at it. But that is something perhaps we're going to have to discuss at some other time.
No, well, I think that's the most important thing. There are elements in place. Let's get the discussion started. We know what didn't happen. One day this war will end. To make sure that we don't go back to another war-like situation within the next 10 years, we need to start the discussion on the elements that still need final status. And one of those is Jerusalem. Our ideas might be out of the box, but if it helps the people in charge to start thinking about it, to get out of the box ideas, then that's already a change in the status quo, and that might facilitate getting to a final hopeful outcome.
That's a great. I think it's a good ending. We have sort of thrown some good ideas here and there. If we would take your paper and incorporate the mechanism for implementation, this would be probably an interesting, definitely interesting paper to read. And we should think in terms of putting it together.
Absolutely. We love it.
Putting it together as a major essay, putting all these elements together, and further refine them, do further research, specifically from the religious component, because it's the heart. It's the heart of this whole proposal. It's a sort of, like I said, combination between my ideas and their ideas, but creating this entity is certainly something that ought to be looked into as a possibility.
It would be both a pleasure and an honor working with you on this. So let's keep the conversation going. Hopefully it will bring something good.
All right. Well, thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Carlein, for taking the time. I think we did something. Okay. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode on the issues. You can find this podcast on my SoundCloud page, and stay tuned to my social media accounts for the latest analysis and announcements.